Hi. Well, good morning. I'm sorry that it's not the rest of politics team. I sort of felt like that intro sounded like maybe they were here. But I'm delighted instead to be joined by Anna Dack, who joins us from Meta, and Laura Redmond, who joins us from BBD Perfect Storm. I'm Rebecca. I'm the editor of The News Movement. We're a social-first journalism business for Gen Z audiences. And we use our insights and our audience intelligence that we get from telling those stories to help brands and our partners better reach and engage with that cohort, which we're obviously talking about this morning. And I feel like at the top of any conversation about Gen Z, we really can't emphasize enough just how different this generation is from millennials, boomers, Gen Xers, and the rest of them. Gosh, that was very loud, wasn't it? I boomed as I said boomers. Their kind of entry into the world has been marked by some really dislocated moments. They've had Brexit, Trump, they've emerged into a cost of living crisis, an opioid crisis, a climate crisis. Their formative years at the end of their formal education or at university was characterized by a pandemic with learning from home and isolation. So they've emerged into a world through a really, really interesting time on the kind of global scene, and of course, war in Europe and the horrors that we see unfolding in the Middle East. And so, of course, the way that they view the world is really different from those generations that go before them. They have a really different set of expectations from those big institutions because they've kind of been let down. So I think those things of the 70-hour week, the Samantha Jones girl boss, I think they think that's all nonsense. And their definitions of success are much more around demarcating their work and life balance. They work to live, not the other way around. They do side hustles, not to kind of acquire more capital. They do it to bring themselves joy. And they are unequivocal in demanding sustainability, representation, and equity. These are settled matters for this generation. And I think there's an awful lot we can learn from them. And a few things that are maybe a bit frustrating if you're trying to manage a team of them, but that's maybe a different session. But they're also not apathetic, are they? They are an activist generation. And I think we've seen that a lot recently over the last few months, especially with what's been happening in the Middle East. I'm sure we've all got Gen Zs in our lives, in our workforces, in our families. But they're not tribally political anymore. That kind of blue, red, Labour, Tory, whatever colour the parties are. What colour's Nigel Farage? Permanently red. It doesn't really work. But it's not to say that they don't care. And it's so important that they do care because this year is the year of democracy. 2 billion Gen Zs will have the opportunity to vote in the elections this year. 49% of the world's population will go to the polls. And because of where Gen Z are, they haven't reached their economic peak yet. They don't have that kind of buffer from the decisions that are made at the ballot box in the way that other demographics do. So if taxation goes up, if education gets harder, if plans to improve the planet are delayed, Gen Z will feel that the most. So it's really important that they are engaged in what's happening in 2024. And we need to ensure that happens by building trust. And us as publishers have got a real challenge there because we know that this generation have a hostility towards those big institutions. They are the demographic most likely not to engage with mainstream news. So they don't have Twitter, they don't have the news alerts on the phone, they're probably not listening to the rest of politics, which means that they're also the most susceptible to misinformation and disinformation. And Gen Z are the most likely to believe COVID conspiracy theories. So there's this direct correlation between this generation of people that absorb, that are on the internet all the time. They want to be proactive and they want to do things, but they're equally susceptible to the bad actors that we know operate online. So it's a really interesting challenge that publishers need to meet, but that today we're going to talk about how all sectors kind of help do that. And I'm delighted to have you both join us, and I'm glad we're going to solve it all in 20 minutes. Easy. So I guess the first question is, should brands be getting involved in this? Should brands be helping to improve the democratic process? And I guess both of you have got your brand hats on, but also your sort of platform hats. So I'll come to you first, Anna. What do you think?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And, it's no secret, Meta is no stranger to elections. It's a huge priority for the platform around the world. And there's a lot that I think a platform has as a responsibility, both in terms of sort of preventing interference, as you mentioned, restricting sort of misinformation on the platforms, ensuring that political ads are correctly labeled and transparency is clear. But also, I think, from a platform perspective, and certainly something that I think Meta does quite well, is also ensuring people have the right information at their fingertips to be able to go and vote. And whether that's kind of UIs on the platform that show where your nearest polling station is, or stickers that show I've gone and I've voted. So I think the responsibility for platforms is really important, but also in terms of that knowledge sharing and that access to information, I think that's a huge part of the responsibility too.
And what advice have you given to brands in this space when they're coming up to an election, when there's a big kind of cause conversation?
I think it's really important because brands are such a big part of society. They are a big part of our culture. And I think it's important that they can and should be part of a conversation if it's right. And by that, I mean it has to be deeply rooted in their DNA to be part of that conversation in the fact that if they're just doing it to ride the wave, to drive awareness, they will be exposed very, very quickly. But if it's a cause that they believe in, truly, and it's in the fabric of their business, in their employees, everything, then absolutely take a stand, but understand your audience, understand that you might have an audience that doesn't agree with what you'll say, but don't reverse out of that. You know, why are you being involved? Is it right to get into the conversation and the discourse at that time? If you can't maintain that position, then find a different way. And because brands can drive, they can give to culture. It's just in many different ways. It might be actually, you know, filling the gaps where policy is failing. And that's a really interesting way for them to go as well.
I guess the high crime with this audience particularly is being performative. You know, they are very aware of kind of conversations, causes being co-opted for the wrong reasons, and that's almost as worse as bad rather than not doing it at all. One of our kind of main methods for building that trust to have that conversation with our audience is about making sure that we are delivering content following the kind of behaviors and mechanisms that they already use. So we know that people are in the mood when they're on Instagram for kind of a human-led story. That's not the same as good news. And people always talk about people wanting good news. And if they did, the news industry would look very different to the way it does. When you're on TikTok or YouTube Shorts, you want that like dopamine hit. I want like a tiger attacking someone, or I want these big flashy moments. I want punchy, quick storytelling. When I'm on YouTube, maybe I want to lean back, I want to listen, I've got more time to absorb something. So there's these like different ways of telling stories on different platforms. Can brands do that though? Like, do brands have the agility, or do they need to think differently to adapt the methods of storytelling? And do you think they're prepared to? Laura, I'll come to you first.
I think, let's say, legacy brands struggle in terms of how they are set up, in terms of the teams, in terms of what they're used to. And to be honest, it's more the younger brands coming through that are very agile and can adopt. Legacy brands need to be agile, they need to adopt, they need to be able to, the same message, but just in terms of understanding the nuance of communities, their language, the codes of communication, in order not to kind of try and drive their own narrative, but understand what's happening in that community and adapt. And that takes more time, more effort. You can't be lazy here. You need to kind of be wearing a slightly different hat. Same message, but just how it's kind of delivered is really important.
Do you think brands would be comfortable to show up in completely different ways on different platforms? So for us, our experience on Instagram, the experience that a user has on those different places, it feels quite different, kind of deliberately. But is that something, do brands want that kind of homogenous, if you're dealing with us, this is what we're like, whether we're here, there, or wherever else?
I actually think one of the biggest mistakes brands can make is thinking that they should be everywhere all at once. And I think, just putting my comms hat on for a minute and thinking about how I approach communications campaigns, but I think everything needs to just start with an audience insight and knowing where the overlap between the audience you want to reach and your brand message exists. If I'm thinking about AI or an open source message, I wouldn't maybe have that show up on Instagram in the way, even at all, potentially. Thinking about formats is so important, and thinking about the channels you use is so important, because the demographic is different, the community is different, the conversation is different. And if you're not approaching it in that way, starting with the insight, then it's just going to be a miss, or it's just not going to be engaged with in the way that you really want it to, and it's not going to land with the authenticity, as you mentioned, Laura, that it needs to. So that's kind of how I would approach it.
The other thing that we found is that you need to really reflect the conversations and concerns as they happen in real terms. So an issue starts, and then things develop, sentiment changes. We've seen that particularly, for example, in the Middle East. It started, and now the concerns, the conversation, the actions has continued. The campaign has worsened, and so people's interest has not diminished, but in fact, you could argue that it's got worse. It's kind of heightened, but the conversations, the concerns people are having has changed. We at the News Movement, for example, with the election, realised that the government and the kind of political parties were pushing manifesto messages about tax, the NHS, and kind of, home ownership, which are not necessarily the immediate concerns of Gen Z. And instead, we've saw that lots of the kind of conversation was around, are any of these people going to keep our nightclubs open? Like, this is great that you're talking about tax, but like, actually for us, we're young people. And so we've kind of made one of our priorities for this campaign to kind of hold people's account to that. And we've formed this thing called the After Dark Alliance, which we'd love to talk to people about in this room if you're interested, but kind of trying to get together a sort of coalition of brands, publishers, influencers to kind of put pressure on the parties to reflect the interests of young people. And again, I'd ask, do brands have the agility to adapt to that, or what kind of internal processes almost need to be ignored so that you can have that, okay, actually the conversation has shifted here, sentiment is now here on this issue, and we need to be there? Laura, what do you think?
I think it's back to really understanding your position. And I think once you're very clear on your position and what you stand for, and it's back to that rooted in their DNA, then you have confidence to be able to adapt and be agile in terms of those conversations. I think, yes, brands can and should be able to do that. I just think certain systems where it feels like you've got to control it in such a way as a brand is where you almost need to be moving away from that and be much more dynamic in the approach. But it all comes back to, don't adapt your storytelling to suit particular audiences. Because you will upset certain people. It will always happen. There's always going to be a debate, but stick with it. And I actually think more needs to be, we're helping brands do that. How do you move from kind of full control and distributing your content in a way that's been approved by several hundred people, and then it's out? You will get left behind in culture if you behave that way. So I think it comes back to truly understanding your audience, making sure that the cause that you might be supporting is deeply rooted in your DNA, and then you'll have the confidence and build the teams that allow you to kind of move with that narrative and that social discourse as to what's happening at the time. And it can be uncomfortable, but I think that's where you need to adapt.
Yeah, it's got to be uncomfortable. And with your kind of comms hat on rather than platform, is that something that you've maybe done kind of previously or you've seen done well? I won't ask you to name it being done badly, although that's a question I'd love to ask.
I mean, we experiment with our owned channels a lot. So we at Meta, we have a presence on TikTok, we have a presence on Instagram, obviously we have a big presence on X. And I think it's embarrassing to say, but only really recently have we started to get that formula right in terms of where we show up and how. So again, it's what you said, it's not always authentic. I mean, the message is the message, right? So you should absolutely approach everything with a campaign mindset in terms of making sure that message is reaching the right people in the right ways. But like, I can give you an example recently in terms of, if we're using exec voices to talk about something important, whether it's responsibility or otherwise, it just doesn't hit on Facebook very well. We can put content out, but, consumers want to hear about cool products and the amazing, exciting innovations that we have coming out of the company. They don't necessarily want to be preached to by an exec at the company who's talking to you about responsibility. That doesn't come across as authentic, to that point, again, of being strategic about that message. So again, it's a channel first approach as well as it is an audience first approach. So identifying where your audience is and what's going to resonate the most with them.
We talked about it briefly, but obviously this is a generation that have grown up online. So they are kind of consummate navigators of the online space. We were kind of given the internet. You remember getting your Facebook account or your Bebo or your BBM. This lot grew up watching YouTubers, creators, influencers, a part of their ecosystem. And we've also touched briefly on the impact of these bad agents and misinformation online, and around elections especially, that's really heightened, these deep fakes, these AI voices, not just in the UK and in the US, but globally. And that really is a huge issue for everyone, and it's kind of thwarting democracy, not to get kind of too profound and depressed about it, but everyone has a responsibility there, governments, publishers and brands. How do you get into that space? Like, with that authenticity, and how do you prove to your audience that you're doing it for the right reasons? I'll come to you, Anna, because also you've got the meta responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, misinformation is so important, and as a platform that houses billions and billions of people who want to be online and feel safe online and feel engaged in the election process in a way that is safe, Meta takes an approach to misinformation that is remove, reduce, and inform. So if there is content on the platform that would incite real-world harm or violence, then it is removed from the platform. However, when it comes to misinformation, we take an approach of identifying it as false and then alerting people to the fact it's false and dramatically reducing its circulation on the platform. And that's because we just don't want to create an information vacuum, because Meta isn't the only platform out there. This misinformation will probably spread across other platforms as well. And it's giving people the context to recognize that, oh, this is wrong and here's why. So it's about notifying people to ensure that they aren't then spreading that news. And we kind of know that works. I think there's a statistic now that 95% of posts that have been corrected are not clicked on again. So there's an argument here that we need to just educate people as well, because we know this exists. It's not, this isn't a perfect approach. There's so much work that needs to be done in this space, and I think AI will help advance that a lot. But yeah, that's the kind of approach that Meta would take to things like misinformation and continuing to try and keep people safe online and informed.
The role of AI, obviously, it's this kind of incredible force that's being unleashed on the world. It's got as much it could be as much a force for good as it can a force for bad. There's a debate about kind of how to combat misinformation. You're obviously talking about kind of keeping it up but correcting it. But there's also that argument that by kind of keeping up or republishing it and trying to myth bust, you can't be certain that anyone sees the correction, and that maybe what you've ended up doing is just circulating that. And do people still think, oh, maybe there was a kernel of truth in what I saw that wasn't correct? How can we use AI in a way that's not the robots are unleashed and we all need to go and hide under our beds?
Yeah. I mean, this is a technology that is advancing so rapidly, and actually, in terms of how we see it at Meta, but it's very much sort of a sword as well as a shield, in the sense that, it's that kind of fight misinformation and protect people online. And actually, AI advancements over the last half of this year, because of our continued innovation in this space, 3 billion fake accounts have been taken down because of AI. So there is a degree of this is technology that will help us identify false information, false accounts quicker and faster and with more agility, that will then hopefully, build on the efforts that Meta are making to kind of keep people safe online. So I think it will come with a lot of good, but obviously this is a very rapidly evolving space, and it's absolutely not perfect yet.
No. Laura, if you had a client that came to you and said, so we'd love to use some AI technology to counter some fake news about insert topical issue, climate change, something like that, what would you say? Would you kind of not answer the call, give it to some hospital pass? What's your reaction? What would your reaction be, and what would your counsel be to your client?
Gosh, what question. I think I'd always approach it as in, what is your ambition here? It's always back to the why, and what you get. Obviously, there's a purpose there, is to try and distill and understand. But it's such an interesting landscape in terms of where they're playing, and I think that's quite difficult for brands as well, how to navigate this and how to understand it. I think it would be let's understand and discuss the absolute role of what you're trying to achieve, and where do we look to make sure that it's fact-based. And I think that's very difficult. And that's where, for brands, it always has to come back to their truth. It has to come back to the information that is solid. And I think Gen AI in that can support, but I think it would be quite an interesting place to go. And maybe I would, I think we'd bring in some really experts.
Yeah, no, good answer. Interesting, working quite hard there. You've both mentioned authenticity a lot, and obviously one of the ways of being authentic with this audience is showing up and kind of looking and sounding like them. So we've talked about kind of mimicking their consumption habits, tapping into the conversations and concerns that they have, but you've also got to deliver that message in a really plausible way, and that comes down to having that kind of diversity and that Gen Z representation in those organizations and in those brands. Do you feel like that's been embraced? I mean, we've talked about the kind of their work, what they're like to manage and what they're like in the workforce. Do you feel like brands are harnessing Gen Z voices and listening to them, or do you think it's a lot of people who maybe aren't Gen Z, slightly assuming? Laura, I'll come to you and then I'll come to you.
Absolutely, they're embracing it. I think they understand, to be relevant, to be part of culture, to add to culture. It's so important to listen to those voices, and without that, then they will be ignored. They will be flicked past, and it's really important that they are finding that voice. I think, though, it's really important that they don't just show up because they feel they have to in that respect, or they feel that this is what they want to hear. I think that they'll be exposed so quickly that it's back to just understanding what you're trying to achieve, where you need to have that narrative, and who are you getting advice and guidance from to make sure that that narrative is landing in a really strong way. If you're trying to do it from a different perspective and not truly understand that audience, then it just won't work. And as much as they try, and I think bring them in as much as you can, and listen to those voices.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with all of that. I think it's also important to remember that consumer consumption habits change really rapidly, and actually the way conversations show up is really different. My consumer consumption habits have dramatically changed, and I think as a generation matures, so do theirs. And actually being nimble enough to know where to show up and how is also really important. I think if you just look at the history of Meta, not to put my platform hat back on again, but if you think about, Facebook Live and long form video into Reels, into images on Instagram, and actually where conversations are showing up with brands aren't always sort of under the grid post. Like, not everybody is going to engage with a conversation under a post or on a story. A lot of the times the conversation is in DMs or it's in chat. So brands need to also think about sparking the conversation in a way that is going to kind of transcend that initial post, but move into kind of how the conversation continues offline, online, in all realms. So there's that to consider, I think, as well.
This could obviously all go horribly wrong. So we're kind of working on the hypothesis that brand chooses cause that's relevant to the DNA. It basically lands with the audience. We've delivered the message in the way they want it. We've used people who the audience kind of relate and it resonates with. I mean, could you understand if brands were like, do you know what? Like the risk that this goes wrong is too high, and could you understand the reticence there, or do you think actually it's like we've got to move with the times now?
Oh no, it could absolutely go wrong. And actually, coming from a company that is so risk averse, like I think it's that consideration is so crucial, and you can get it so wrong, and that's just going to be so damaging to a reputation of a company. And again, it comes back to the Laura, your point about authenticity. It's like, if you don't have a reason to do it, don't do it. Would be my argument.
You would say better to get left behind and be silent on something, or take the risk?
It depends what it is. Like, if it is a cause that is important and it resonates with it, then absolutely, I think there is a reason and a why. If there is a why, then absolutely show up. But I don't think you should do something for the sake of doing something. I think it can come across as inauthentic, and that to a generation who are so attuned to that, I think that's worse. That could be worse.
Yeah. Laura, what do you think?
Yeah, it's a generation, it's a new cohort of voters that are coming through that are demanding more accountability from brands, and brands really need to lift the lid and understand what they stand for. I think in some respects, if there is any chink, if there is any reason why you shouldn't be involved, and there is this element of being left behind, but it's actually understanding where you could add and give back in a slightly different way. And I think that's where they do have this incredible spending power. They're big corporations, they're very integrated in politics in that respect. It's actually if it's not in that direct conversation, what is it that they can achieve that's almost giving back to that society and giving in changing culture, helping culture be better? Is it a healthy conversation? Is it a healthy debate that they can drive? And I think that's something that they can look at. But I think any chink, war game, think about it, plan it, understand where your audience might disagree, and are you prepared for that? And I think, again, it does come back to, if it's not streaming through every fibre of that company, then think of doing it in a different way.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The final question, because we're thinking about the future, is this just a moment, because we've got a lot of people going to the polls this year, we've got a mildly exciting election here, there's quite an explosive one happening over the Atlantic. Is this just a moment and brands are like, oh, it's quite a political kind of year, and are we going to just go back to sponsoring music festivals next year? Or do you think this is the shape of things to come? Laura, I'll come to you, and then Anna, I'll come to you.
Oh, I think it's the shape of things to come, to be honest. I think brands need to adapt. Like we said, they need to be much more dynamic. They need to be much more thoughtful about the different types of communities, about online culture, how to interact. And I think that will change how they're set up, how they operate. So yeah, I don't think it's going to go away. I think it should be a main pillar in what they're doing in everyday comms and cause, if they believe in it. And I think that will come up. It shouldn't just be a one-off. It should be a constant theme as to what they're doing. If it's a one-off, then just don't bother.
That's to your point about authenticity. Like if you're just doing it for this year,
if you're just doing it for the awareness and ride the wave, then again they'll quickly be identified by this generation as that's what you're doing.
Yeah.
I completely agree. I don't think this is going anywhere. I think it's something that brands need to continue to challenge themselves to think about. And I think elections are something that obviously spark that a lot. And actually continuing that through everything they do strategically will be really important in how that brand succeeds. And the ones that are authentic are the ones that will really thrive, and the ones that aren't are the ones that will kind of fall behind.
Yeah, absolutely. We have come in exactly on time. That wasn't like the ITV debate, was it, where we had to keep talking over each other? So well done. Thank you so much for your time. And we've now got some time for questions, I believe. Oh, that's okay.
Hello, thank you. Thank you so much. That was super interesting. I actually work for a charitable organization called Bite Back. Now, for us, it's really difficult to engage with the election because there are a lot of rules for charities around like them not being allowed to like favor one side over the other. So we are really struggling with like how are we, and we specifically work with young people. So how do we engage our young people, give them the right information they need, while at the same time remaining apolitical? It's a very complicated scenario to be in. So I would appreciate any advice you had for me.
Yeah, compliance is a big old thing, isn't it? Laura, coming to you on that.
I think it's really interesting. I think it's back to understanding what you stand for and how you can help that audience, and understanding the audience in which you want to resonate with. So how can you, it's always good to help promote healthy debate. It's always, it's an interesting place to stay, to be. I would dig deep into what do you stand for and how can you communicate fact and truth and be human in these times that will kind of drive that awareness for you. I know it's not necessarily a case of you've got an opinion on lots of different things. I think it's just coming back to what information can you provide your audience that might help them make decisions, but not moving too far into the political debate in that respect.
Exactly that, I think, and also like being mindful of the fact that it's not necessarily about telling people how to vote or, as you mentioned, creating bias, but acknowledging also that the election touches areas of people's lives that are so vast and so diverse, and actually, making sure you're showing up and speaking to the ones that resonate authentically to your organization.
I think also transparency as well. So explaining why you can or can't, or, kind of being transparent about the reasons that you're able to do things, I think is really interesting. I think they kind of like to understand, kind of what's going on kind of behind the curtain in a way that, it helps build the trust and authenticity, but also just explains and kind of demystifies the process as well. That's a great question. Thank you for that. Excellent. Well, I think we've solved the future of truth. Brilliant. Thank you so much for joining us. That was really, really interesting. And I hope that gave everyone in here lots to think about. And you take it into the year ahead. And we find lots of brilliant ways for brands to engage this mysterious but essential demographic and enhance democracy for good. All before lunch. Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day.
It does.